It is welcomed that the BBC accepts Lord Dyson's findings in full. BBC employees used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother.
It was just an old jewelry box, or so they thought. But what Prince William allegedly discovered inside had nothing to do with diamonds, and everything to do with a secret Diana may have hidden for decades. You won't believe what he found. Hit that subscribe button. This story is unforgettable. Kensington Palace had always been filled with stories. Every room held echoes of the past, but there was one room that no one had talked about in years. It was hidden in the far corner of the East Wing, quietly sealed off, untouched for almost 3 decades. In early 2024, that quiet room was about to reveal something no one could have imagined. Prince William had agreed to a renovation project. It was supposed to be routine, just another part of the palace being refreshed. But as he walked through the long, polished corridors, something pulled him towards that forgotten door. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, dust swirling in the light that streamed through the tall windows. Inside, it was like stepping into a memory. Everything was still there. Shelves lined with well-loved books, framed photographs slightly faded with time, even his mother's favorite fountain pens sitting on her desk, like she had just left the room for a moment. The room hadn't changed, but William had. He wasn't a child anymore. He stood there quietly, letting it all sink in. The life his mother had lived within those walls, the dreams she must have written about, the thoughts she had kept to herself. As his eyes moved across the room, something strange caught his attention. There was a writing desk in the corner, its dark wood slightly worn but elegant. He ran his hand along its surface, remembering her sitting there. Then something unexpected happened. His fingers brushed against a small gap near the bottom of the desk, a thin space that didn't belong. Curious, he pressed gently, and with a soft click, a hidden panel popped open. Tucked inside was a small, old jewelry box, wrapped in delicate silk. It wasn't just any box. This had been carefully hidden, protected, maybe even forgotten by everyone else, but not by Diana. She had left it there, quietly waiting for the right moment, for the right person, to uncover what was inside. And William's heart raced, knowing this was just the beginning. William sat down in the quiet room, the old jewelry box resting gently in his hands. The silk wrap had yellowed slightly with age, but it was still soft, carefully tied as if protecting something precious. He untied it slowly, half expecting to see the usual royal heirlooms, perhaps a bracelet he remembered from childhood or one of Diana's famous necklaces. And yes, the first things he saw were exactly that. Beautiful pieces of jewelry shining quietly in the morning light, each carrying memories from public appearances and cherished family moments. But as William looked closer, he realized there was something different about this box. Nestled between the familiar jewels was a tiny metal key, barely bigger than his thumb. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't fancy, just a plain key lying quietly among the sparkling treasures. His curiosity grew. He carefully lifted the velvet lining from the bottom of the box and discovered a hidden compartment. It was incredibly well hidden, something easily missed if you weren't searching closely. Inside the compartment was something even more surprising, a slim, delicate notebook with a soft leather cover. It was worn, its edges frayed, the pages slightly curled, but it had been protected all these years beneath jewels and silk. On the cover, in soft gold lettering, was one simple word: Reflections. William sat very still, the notebook in his lap, realizing this was not just a box of jewelry. It was a box of memories, of secrets, possibly even answers. What had his mother wanted him to find? Why had she hidden this away? With a quiet breath, William opened the first page, unaware of just how much his life was about to change. The first page greeted William with the familiar swirl of his mother's handwriting. It was neat but alive, each letter carrying emotion. These weren't official statements or speeches written by royal advisors. This was his mother, writing just for herself. The words weren't about glamorous events or public life. They were deeply personal, quiet moments of thought. She spoke about her fears, her hopes, and the quiet battles she had fought behind the palace walls. William read slowly, feeling the weight of every sentence. There were stories of loneliness, about trying to smile for the world while feeling completely invisible inside the palace. She wrote about the boys, about him and Harry. She described moments where she felt powerless to protect them, worried that their voices might be shaped by others before they could fully understand who they were. One line stood out more than anything else. Diana had written, "The world sees me, but it doesn't hear me." William felt the words land heavily on his heart. He had heard his mother described by newspapers, by documentaries, by endless commentators, but this was different. This was her voice, quiet and honest. And as he kept reading, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a diary. It was a hidden message, a piece of his mother's heart that had been locked away, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. But there were more. Pages turned from soft reflections to something deeper, something urgent, something William wasn't sure he was ready to face. As William turned the next few pages, the writing seemed to soften again. These weren't entries about public life or palace affairs. These were words of a mother, quietly thinking about her children. Diana wrote about simple moments with William and Harry, walks in the gardens, bedtime stories, laughter over small things. She described how those little moments were the happiest of her life, moments where the cameras couldn't follow and the pressure couldn't reach her. But her joy was mixed with something else, worry. She wondered if the world would let her boys grow up freely. Would they be allowed to be themselves? Or would the expectations of their titles shape their every choice before they even had a chance to dream for themselves? William's heart tightened as he read her words. "I want them to know kindness first," Diana wrote, "before the world teaches them duty." It was something William had never thought about this way before. As a child, the world around him had always felt normal because he didn't know any different. But reading his mother's quiet fears, it became clear to him that she had carried this burden silently, hoping to shield her children from the parts of royal life that weighed her down. The final sentence on one of the pages stayed with him. "I hope when they grow older, they remember the sound of my laugh more than the sound of the crowds." William closed the book gently for a moment, realizing that in that small room with those fragile pages, he was finally hearing his mother in a way he never had before. But there was still so much more to uncover, something hidden deeper in the pages that wasn't just about memories. It was about warnings. The tone of the diary shifted. As William continued reading, the soft reflections faded into sharper, more serious words. Diana's handwriting became tighter, the lines more focused, like she was writing with urgency, trying to get her message down before it was too late. She began to mention things William had never heard before, not just feelings, but patterns. Moments when conversations would stop as she entered a room. Invitations that never came. Decisions made that affected her life, but always without her knowledge. There were even mentions of strange coincidences, articles in the newspapers appearing just days after certain private events, details only a few people inside the palace could have possibly known. Diana never named specific reasons, but her words hinted at something that troubled her deeply, something she wanted her sons to understand. "I'm not imagining these things," she wrote. "They think I'm emotional, but I'm simply paying attention." William felt a strange chill as he read those lines. Growing up, he had always been told about public duty, about how the world saw them. But these pages revealed something else, his mother's quiet fight to be heard, to be respected, and to protect her boys from forces she couldn't always see but clearly felt around her. And the deeper he read, the more it became obvious. This wasn't just a diary, it was a quiet map, a trail of breadcrumbs Diana had left behind, hoping that someday someone would follow it. William leaned back, realizing this was only the beginning. There were truths his mother had discovered, truths she had tried to document, and he was only starting to uncover what they meant. As William carefully turned another page, something jumped out at him, something personal. There was an entry written in the middle of the summer of 1997, just weeks before everything in their lives had changed. The sentence was short, but it hit William like a wave. "I've told Harry the truth. He must hold it until he's ready." William blinked, reading the sentence again, making sure he hadn't misunderstood. His mother had written these words with intention, carefully, deliberately. The truth, but what truth? His thoughts raced. Why would his mother tell Harry something important and not tell him? Why leave him out of something so serious? As he read further, the writing became less direct, more cryptic. Diana spoke in circles, mentioning family matters, long-standing decisions, quiet secrets hidden beneath royal tradition. It wasn't explained clearly, but it was obvious she had chosen to tell Harry something William was never told. William sat in silence, feeling a strange mixture of confusion and sadness. Had his mother seen something in him that made her hold back? Or had she simply felt he wasn't ready at the time? He thought back to his relationship with Harry. Over the years, they had grown apart. They had their own paths, different roles, different responsibilities. But now, reading these words, William wondered if part of the distance had always been there, something unseen between them. He realized there was only one person who might know what his mother had meant, only one person who could explain what Diana had left unsaid. William took a deep breath. There was a conversation he needed to have, one that was long overdue. It wasn't easy to make the call. William sat in his private study, The diary closed beside him, his heart feeling heavier than it had in years. He hesitated for a while, wondering what to say, how to even start a conversation that touched something so personal. But he knew he couldn't ignore it. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. Finally, he dialed Harry's number. The conversation started simply, small talk, polite words, a little awkwardness that had become all too familiar between them. But William couldn't hold it back. He quietly told Harry what he had found about the jewelry box, the hidden diary, and most importantly, the sentence that had shaken him. "I've told Harry the truth." There was silence on the other end of the line. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then, in a quiet voice, Harry answered, "I always thought you knew too." William sat back in his chair, surprised. Harry explained that, yes, their mother had shared something with him when he was younger. Something about the family, about how certain things worked behind the palace walls, but it had never been talked about again. He said Diana told him it wasn't the right time for William to know. It wasn't a long conversation, but it changed something. William realized his mother had prepared them differently. She had tried to protect both of them, but in different ways. And maybe without realizing it, they had both been carrying their own pieces of her story, separately. The call didn't fix everything between them, but it opened a door, a small step toward understanding, toward reconnecting, not as royal figures, but simply as two brothers, both shaped by their mother's quiet, powerful words. As William returned to the diary, he noticed something about the next group of entries. They weren't just personal reflections or emotional notes. These pages read almost like quiet reports. Diana had been keeping track of things, carefully writing down moments, dates, and patterns she had observed inside the palace. She wrote about meetings she hadn't been invited to, decisions made about her role without her involvement. She described how conversations shifted when she walked into a room, how invitations suddenly stopped arriving after certain disagreements. These weren't wild guesses. These were detailed observations from someone who had learned to pay close attention. One line stood out. "They think I'm distracted, but I'm listening more than ever." William felt like he was seeing a side of his mother that few people ever talked about. A woman who was not only loving and caring, but sharp, observant, and determined. She hadn't been simply reacting to the world around her. She had been watching, remembering, and quietly writing it all down. There were moments where she mentioned small victories, times when she had been able to push back, to stand her ground. But more often, the entries carried a feeling of quiet frustration, of being outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Reading it now, William realized just how alone his mother must have felt. The world had always seen her smiling in front of cameras, but these pages revealed the quiet battle she had been fighting in the background. And William felt something change inside him. This wasn't just about understanding the past, it was about seeing the full picture of his mother's strength and courage, even when no one else seemed to notice. As William continued reading, the story inside the diary took an unexpected turn. His mother's words, which had often reflected frustration and sadness, suddenly shifted to something softer, more reflective. She began writing about his father, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding William had never expected to see. Diana wrote about small moments she had shared with Charles after their separation, little gestures that, at the time, she had brushed aside. A brief handwritten note he had sent, a kind smile during a public event, or even a bouquet of her favorite flowers left anonymously at her door. In one entry, she admitted, "Maybe I misjudged his quiet moments. Maybe they were his way of reaching out." William felt something inside him soften. For so long, he had looked at his father through the lens of those difficult years filled with tension, distance, and misunderstandings. But now, reading these personal notes, he saw a different perspective. Diana had realized, toward the end, that both of them had been caught in the same impossible world. She even wrote, "Perhaps we were both trying to be heard in a place that only rewards silence." This single line stayed with William. It made him think about his father, not just as the figurehead of a family, but as a person who had also been shaped by the same system that had pushed Diana to the edge. William sat quietly, reflecting on it all. Maybe his father's quietness wasn't coldness. Maybe it was simply his way of coping. It wasn't about rewriting history, it was about seeing it with clearer eyes. And with that, William began to feel a deeper understanding, not just of his mother, but of his father too. As William moved through the later pages, the focus shifted once again. This time, it wasn't just about people or personal relationships, it was about something bigger, something that affected every part of Diana's life. She described the constant presence of the media, but not in the way the world usually spoke about it. This wasn't about paparazzi chasing her through the streets. This was about something more controlled, more planned. She wrote about how private moments would suddenly appear in the newspapers, how stories were twisted, and how every small mistake was turned into a headline. They don't just report, Diana had written. They create. She noted how certain stories always seemed to pop up after particular meetings or arguments within the palace. Personal conversations would find their way into tabloids, usually painting her as difficult, emotional, or out of control. Over time, the picture the world saw wasn't her. It was a version of her created to serve someone else's purpose. Reading these words, William felt a quiet frustration rise within him. He remembered similar headlines that had appeared over the years, not just about his mother, but also about him and his brother, and even more recently about Catherine. It suddenly became so clear. The same pattern Diana had quietly documented hadn't disappeared. It had just moved forward in time, touching the next generation. William realized this wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about recognizing how history was quietly repeating itself, and how easy it was for the world to believe a story that wasn't always real. The more he read, the more determined he became. He understood now that the change his mother had longed for hadn't arrived. Yet. William thought he had reached the end of the diary. The last entry was dated just weeks before everything changed in their lives. He closed the book, feeling the weight of everything his mother had written. But as he placed the diary back in the jewelry box, he noticed something odd. The bottom of the box felt uneven. Curious, he pressed gently, and a hidden layer lifted up. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper, slightly yellowed with age but carefully protected. It wasn't part of the diary. It was separate. On the top were 3 simple words: "To my sons." William unfolded it with care, his heart beating faster. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but the words inside were softer, different from the diary. It felt like his mother was speaking directly to them, not as a princess, not as a public figure, but simply as their mom. She wrote about her hopes for them, about the pressures she knew they would face. She apologized for moments they wouldn't understand, for choices she had made to protect them in ways they might not see until they were older. One line stood out: "Don't let the world make you cold. Let it see your kindness." There was no ending to the letter. The final sentence trailed off, unfinished, as if she had meant to return to it but never had the chance. William sat in the quiet room, holding the letter close. It was a reminder of who his mother really was beyond all the headlines and rumors, a woman who loved deeply and wanted her sons to hold on to their hearts no matter what the world expected of them. And in that moment, William felt something settle inside him. He knew what he had to do next. William didn't make any big announcements. There were no interviews, no bold statements, no public confessions. Sitting in that quiet room, surrounded by his mother's words, he made a promise, but only to himself. He knew rushing to speak out wouldn't help. His mother had been criticized for every word she spoke. He had learned from that. This wouldn't be about making noise. It would be about making real change, one quiet step at a time. He started with the people closest to him. Slowly, carefully, he began reviewing the names his mother had written down. Some were no longer around, but others still held quiet influence. William worked in silence, asking questions, gathering facts, paying close attention to those who claimed to have his best interests at heart. One by one, shifts began to happen within the palace. People who had quietly held power for years started retiring or moving on. No one said why, no headlines explained it. But William knew. He was clearing the space his mother never could, quietly righting some of the wrongs she had documented so many years ago. But even as he did this, his thoughts kept returning to one person, his brother. No matter how much they had grown apart, they were still 2 pieces of the same story. His mother had loved them both equally, even if she had prepared them differently. And William realized that healing the future of the family couldn't be done alone. He had to bring his brother back into this promise, a promise they could both carry forward. William knew the next step wouldn't be simple. Reaching out to Harry wasn't just about a phone call anymore. It was about rebuilding something that had been quietly breaking for years. This time, when William called, it wasn't as an older brother checking in. It wasn't as a future king. It was as a son who had just uncovered their mother's hidden words. He told Harry about the letter, the diary, and everything their mother had left behind for them to discover. There was a pause on the other end, but instead of tension, there was something different: understanding. Harry listened carefully, and for the first time in a long while, the walls between them seemed to loosen. They talked, not about royal duties or public expectations, but about childhood memories. about the things their mother had taught them, about the little moments she had created to make them feel normal in an unusual world. The conversation didn't solve everything overnight. It didn't erase the years of distance, but it opened a door, a new path forward. Both brothers agreed they would honor their mother's wishes, not by creating public drama, but by quietly protecting the values she had written about: kindness, honesty, and standing up for what was right. They decided to protect each other's peace, to make room for truth in a world that often preferred polished stories. For William, it was the first time in years that he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for his family, for the future, and for the promise that had been waiting quietly in that jewelry box all along. In the weeks that followed, William made one final choice. He had a copy of the diary carefully preserved, not for public viewing, but for personal reflection. It sat quietly in his study, enclosed in a simple glass case. Every morning, he would see it and be reminded of who his mother really was and the silent strength she carried. But it wasn't just about remembering. William allowed those words to guide him in how he led his life moving forward. He made changes, not through grand gestures, but through quiet shifts that people noticed over time. He opened doors that had been shut, listened more, smiled more, showed more of himself than tradition usually allowed. Royal engagements became warmer, less distant. His public appearances reflected more natural conversations instead of formal speeches. Slowly, the crown felt a little less heavy and a little more human. William began to realize that this was the true gift his mother had left behind. Not just a collection of stories, but a path to a different kind of leadership, one built on understanding, on listening, on remembering the simple power of kindness. And as the months passed, even the public noticed. The man they once saw as the heir to the throne now appeared more grounded, more relatable, someone who understood the lessons of the past and was determined not to repeat its mistakes. Diana's quiet words, hidden in a jewelry box for decades, had finally done what she always hoped they would. They reached her sons, they softened old scars, they planted the seeds of something better, and now, every day, as William stepped into his role, he did so knowing he carried more than a title. He carried a promise to honor the lessons his mother had left behind, and to make sure her light continued to shine in the quiet, meaningful ways that truly mattered. What would you have done if you were in William's place? Would you have opened the box? Would you have followed the trail? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more untold stories about the royal family, there's another video waiting for you right here.